The world measures worth in inches and pounds, but not in courage. Rain hammered the streets of Willow Creek, soaking wooden porches and puddling in the main thoroughfare. Mud clung to boots and hems, turning every step into a struggle. Eliza's dress, pale and delicate in better weather, now weighed her down, drenched and dripping. A misstep sent her sprawling forward, landing with a wet thump in the thickening mud. Her arms flailed, trying to catch herself, but it was no use. Her knees, slick with rain and grime, sank slightly as the townsfolk erupted in laughter. "Look at her, she's part mud now," a man shouted, voice sharp as a whip. "She can't even stand straight," a woman added, pointing with a crooked finger. Eliza's chest tightened, every mocking word hammering into her like nails. She scrambled upright, hands pressed against her dress to wipe the grime, cheeks burning. Her mother's face appeared across the street, eyes cold and unsympathetic, betraying no comfort, only quiet disappointment. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wanted to scream, to demand they stop, but words lodged in her throat, lost amid the gales of laughter and rain. The crowd pressed around her, a living wall of ridicule, each pointing finger a reminder of every shame she had endured. Her feet moved without thought, dragging through the muck as she fled toward the edge of town. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, echoing the rhythm of the rain. Every step sank her deeper into the cold, wet earth, yet she did not stop. Escape was the only comfort she could grasp, even if it was fleeting. By the time she reached the old oak at the riverbank, she was trembling, soaked, exhausted. She sank to the ground, knees drawn to her chest, hands clinging to the wet soil. The river beside her flowed indifferent and steady, its gurgle a quiet lullaby against the storm in her chest. Eliza pressed her face to her arms, mud smearing across her cheeks, and felt the familiar sting of hopelessness. Her world had become nothing more than cold water, muddy earth, and the echo of cruel laughter. Yet, somewhere under that suffocating weight, a faint pulse of survival refused to die. Then she heard it, a soft, distant rhythm that rose above the wind and rain. Hooves striking the wet ground in measured beats. She lifted her head, eyes squinting through the mist, and saw a lone figure approaching. A cowboy on horseback, hat low against the rain, his posture calm and unyielding. Not a neighbor, not a family member, someone else. Someone who might see her, not as a joke, not as a failure, but as a person. Her fingers dug into the wet earth. Her lips parted, voice trembling. Maybe not everything is lost. But fate wasn't finished with her yet. The figure drew closer, hooves squelching through the mud, each beat steady and unhurried. Rain streaked the cowboy's coat, plastered hair clinging beneath the wide brim of his hat. Yet he moved with a quiet authority that made the townsfolk's laughter fade into nothing. Eliza's chest heaved, heart hammering in a rhythm she barely recognized. She pressed herself closer to the oak's thick trunk, half afraid, half desperate for help. The cowboy dismounted with careful precision, boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. He approached slowly, eyes soft but steady, scanning her face as if he could see through the layers of shame and mud to something unbroken beneath. "You're soaked," he said, voice calm, unjudging, "and that's no place to linger." Eliza's lips trembled. I'm, her voice caught, swallowed by the wet air. I fell. He nodded once, simply, with a quiet understanding. "I see that. You're stronger than it looks, though." The words were strange to her ears, foreign in their gentleness. Stronger than it looks. Could someone see her at all without mocking her weight, her clumsiness, her mistakes? The cowboy extended a hand, not in accusation, not in pity, but in offer. Her fingers brushed his, hesitant, trembling, sticky with mud. For a long moment she stared at him, unsure if she dared trust the gesture. Finally, with a shuddering breath, she allowed him to lift her from the muddy earth. Her dress squelched, clinging to her, but the warmth of his steady grip and the solid strength of his arms made the world feel less hostile, less heavy. He settled her on the horse's back, careful, measured, as if she were fragile glass. She could feel the pulse of his calm beneath her, a stark contrast to the storm of humiliation that still raged in her chest. Where are you taking me?" she whispered, voice small, fragile. "Somewhere you'll be safe for the night," he said. "Somewhere the mud and the rain don't define you." The townsfolk were distant now, their shouts swallowed by the wind and rain, powerless to reach this fragile moment of rescue. Eliza clung to the horse's mane, heart still pounding, cheeks streaked with both mud and tears. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she could be more than the sum of the cruel laughter, the pointed fingers, and the whispered scorn. The horse moved forward, each step steady, carrying her away from the town that had scorned her, toward a horizon vast and uncertain, but for the first time, bright with possibility. And somewhere in that silence, fate had begun its work. Sometimes the road to safety is paved with uncertainty, and courage is the first step into the unknown. Eliza clung to the horse's mane, rain still dripping from the brim of the cowboy's hat, as the town of Willow Creek vanished behind a veil of mist. The road stretched wide and wild ahead, muddy tracks cutting through the endless sweep of grass and timber. The cowboy rode silently, but there was a rhythm in his silence, steady, grounding, as if every motion was measured to reassure her without words. She could hear the horse's hooves striking the earth, splashing water and mud, and somehow that sound felt like a heartbeat in tune with her own. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of cautious motion, he slowed the horse at a small clearing where a creaking wagon waited. Its wood was worn, wheels slick with mud, but sturdy. He dismounted and extended his hand again, helping her down with the same careful precision he had used moments before. "You don't need to be afraid," he said. His voice carried warmth she hadn't felt in years, though it was restrained, disciplined. "This wagon will carry us a while, away from them, away from judgment." Eliza nodded, fingers brushing the wet fabric of her dress. Words felt impossible. Every syllable threatened to betray the fragile thread of composure she had stitched around herself. She swallowed, letting silence speak instead. The wagon jolted forward, wheels squelching through the softened earth, the horse's breath steaming in the chill morning air. Mist rolled over the plains, curling around gnarled trees, and the horizon seemed endless, vast, and mercilessly open. Eliza's eyes traced the contours of the land, the wide fields, the distant hills, the trembling silver ribbon of the river that mirrored her own uncertain path. Each mile carried her further from ridicule, further from the town that had branded her as unworthy. Each mile whispered a promise of possibility. She stole a glance at the cowboy. His face was calm, expression unreadable, but his eyes held a quiet vigilance. Not a hint of mockery, not a shadow of doubt, just a steady, unwavering presence. "I've never been this far from town," she admitted softly, voice barely above the wind. He glanced briefly at her, a small nod the only acknowledgement. "Then you'll learn, the world outside isn't always cruel. Sometimes, it's just quiet, and quiet has a way of letting people find themselves." Hours passed, the wagon bumped along rutted tracks, the mud sticking stubbornly to the wheels, the rain softening into a drizzle. Eliza's fingers brushed her damp hair from her face as she tried to imagine life beyond humiliation. She pictured a place where she could exist without shame pressing against her every breath, a place where her worth might be measured by courage instead of appearance. The cowboy didn't speak again for a long stretch, letting the road and the rhythm of travel fill the silence, and in that silence, Eliza felt something she had not felt in years, a cautious, trembling curiosity. Curiosity about this man, about the world beyond the town, about herself. As the sun struggled through the clouds, scattering pale light across the fields, the wagon crested a small rise, revealing a landscape both wild and inviting. Rolling pastures, a sparse scattering of trees, and in the distance, the rough silhouette of a ranch awaited, quiet, isolated, but alive with the possibility of shelter and safety. Eliza's heart thumped, not from fear this time, but from the first fragile whisper of hope. Perhaps here, she thought, the mud and mockery would not define her. Perhaps here, she could take the first true breath of freedom. The cowboy's hand rested lightly on the wagon's edge, guiding the horse forward. "We'll rest soon," he said, voice low, steady, "and you'll learn that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet and patient." The road was long, but for the first time, she felt it might carry her to more than just survival. The wagon rumbled over uneven ground, each bump a reminder of the distance they had traveled from the town that had humiliated her. Eliza kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, the patchwork of fields and distant hills stretching endlessly, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life unshackled from ridicule. The cowboy rode beside her, reins loose in one hand, the other resting on the side of the wagon. His presence was steady, unyielding like the land itself. Silence passed between them, comfortable, a companion in the spaces where words had once failed her. "You've been through a lot," he said finally, voice calm but not probing. "Not everyone makes it this far without breaking completely." Eliza's fingers tightened on the edge of the wet wooden seat. I don't know if I can." Her words faltered, swallowed by uncertainty. "I don't know if I can be anything but this." He shook his head gently, eyes on the road. "This isn't who you are. It's what's been done to you. And sometimes surviving is the first kind of courage. Everything else comes after." She swallowed hard, letting his words sink into the knot of fear and shame that had followed her from Willow Creek. For the first time, she didn't feel small, not completely, not in the presence of someone who didn't mock her, who didn't measure her in inches and pounds. As the wagon climbed a gentle rise, the outline of the ranch appeared. Timber buildings with smoke curling from chimneys, animals moving slowly in the fields, a quiet promise of life and routine beyond her reach so far. Eliza's chest tightened. It was unfamiliar. Hope mingled with fear. Could she belong here? Could anyone belong here? The cowboy's voice drew her back from her thoughts. "We'll take it slow. The place is quiet, but it works. You'll learn, and you'll find your place." She nodded, unsure if she believed him, but willing to try. The road had carried her this far, away from the ridicule, away from the mud and shame. Maybe it could carry her all the way. The wagon trundled along a narrow track lined with trees, the river beside them reflecting the pale afternoon light. Rain had stopped entirely, leaving only the smell of wet earth and the soft whisper of wind through leaves. It was peaceful, hauntingly, impossibly peaceful after the storm of Willow Creek. Eliza glanced at the cowboy, his eyes calm, his jaw set, the lines of his face carved by years of quiet endurance. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself in years: trust. Not blind, not easy, but fragile and real. As the ranch drew near, the horse slowed, sniffing the familiar scent of home. The cowboy gestured toward the buildings. That's where you'll stay, not as a guest, not as someone to pity, but as someone who earns her keep, and in time, someone who matters." Eliza swallowed, letting the words wash over her. She wanted to nod, to speak, to leap into his assurance, but she simply sat, still soaked, still trembling, and let the wagon carry her forward. And in that quiet moment, between the rhythmic clop of hooves and the soft creak of the wagon, she realized the first thread of her old life had broken. A thread she had clung to for shame and familiarity, and in its place, something new was beginning, a fragile, trembling promise of safety, of trust, of herself. The quiet of the ranch promised safety, and tests yet unseen. Endurance is often quiet, and respect is earned in the spaces where no one is watching. Eliza stepped from the wagon, mud still clinging stubbornly to her dress and boots. The ranch spread out before her, timber buildings warmed by smoke from chimneys, chickens pecking at the damp earth, a horse whinnying in the distance. Everything smelled of soil, wood, and something stubbornly alive. The cowboy, Silas, stood beside her, hat in hand, eyes calm but watchful. "This will be your home for a while," he said, voice steady. "There's work to be done, nothing fancy, nothing forgiving, but if you stick with it, you'll find your place." Eliza nodded, swallowing against the lump of nervousness rising in her throat. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to find assurance, but she only managed a quiet, "Yes, sir." The first morning arrived with the chill of early light creeping through the windows. The kitchen smelled of coffee and firewood. Silas's children scurried about, small and lively, their laughter cutting through the stillness. "First task," Silas said, voice even, "feed the chickens." Eliza hesitated. The coop loomed before her, wet wood slick with rain and mud. Chickens clucked and pecked, eyes sharp and unyielding. Her hands shook as she reached for the feed, scattering grains unevenly. Feathers brushed against her arms. She flinched, heart thudding in her chest, cheeks warm with shame at her clumsy attempt. Silas observed silently, arms crossed. He said nothing, no critique, no pity, only quiet presence. His gaze, steady and calm, bore a weight that felt like both judgment and opportunity. By midday, sweat and mud mingled on her skin, her dress plastered to her, muscles aching from unfamiliar labor. Yet, a small satisfaction settled in her chest. She had completed the task, not perfectly, not gracefully, but completed. Evening came with golden light spilling through the windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the warmth. Eliza sat by the fire, drying her hands, her heart still echoing with exhaustion and quiet pride. Silas moved through the room, checking tasks silently, nodding occasionally. Not words, but acknowledgement. She watched him, the way he moved with restrained strength, each action deliberate, measured. Something about the steadiness of him made the house feel less daunting, less foreign. A small voice broke her focus. "You're really good at feeding the chickens," one of the children said, eyes wide, tentative. Eliza laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm learning," she admitted. The words were small but honest. A bridge had begun to form. Days passed, routine settled into rhythm, mending fences, hauling water, tending the animals. Tasks that once seemed impossible became manageable. Eliza discovered muscles she hadn't known existed, patience she hadn't believed she possessed. Silas watched silently, offering nods and quiet acknowledgments rather than words, letting her work speak for itself. And slowly, the first inklings of self-pride began to replace the shame she had carried from Willow Creek. The house was no longer just shelter. It was a stage for resilience, each small success a testament to her endurance. The nights were quiet, rain on the roof, the low hum of the river nearby, the distant sounds of animals settling. In those moments, Eliza allowed herself to breathe fully, her body aching, her spirit stretched, yet growing stronger. The house was silent, but in that silence, change was already taking root. The days blurred together in a rhythm of labor and quiet observation. Eliza moved through the ranch like a shadow learning its shape, tentative at first, then gradually steadier. She carried buckets of water, repaired fences with rough, splintered wood, and fed the animals with careful precision. Her body ached in ways it never had before, muscles burning, hands raw from the work. But each ache was proof that she was enduring, surviving, and slowly becoming part of this place that had once seemed foreign. Silas watched, often from a distance, expression calm, unyielding, sometimes a nod, sometimes a brief glance of acknowledgement, but always patient. No words of praise were needed, his silence spoke volumes. One afternoon, she struggled with a particularly stubborn gait, rusted hinges squealing with every tug. Sweat ran down her face, mixing with dirt and grime. Her arms shook, her breath ragged, and she felt the familiar whisper of shame creeping back, reminders of the ridicule from Willow Creek. "You're doing fine," a voice said quietly. She turned to see Silas leaning on the fence, eyes steady on her, not pity, not judgment, just observation. Eliza swallowed, nodded, and pulled again. The gate finally gave way with a sharp squeal, swinging open. Her chest heaved with exhaustion and triumph. Silas offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, and for the first time she felt recognition, not for perfection, but for effort, endurance, and courage. Evenings brought quiet companionship. Eliza learned to bake bread with Silas's children, laughter spilling through the kitchen despite the mess of flour and rolling pins. She found joy in small victories, an egg perfectly cracked, a loaf rising just so. Each success was a balm to the scars of shame she carried. The house, once silent and imposing, became a sanctuary. Its walls no longer felt like barriers, but witnesses to her growth. She was no longer just a visitor. She was a presence, earned through sweat, patience, and persistence. Silas's quiet nods, the children's small words of encouragement, even the animals' familiar rhythms, they all stitched her into the fabric of the ranch. Night settled, stars peeking through clouds that had cleared after a long day. Rain pattered softly on the roof, and the river murmured its endless song. Eliza sat by the fire, hands warm, heart fuller than it had been in years. She allowed herself to feel pride, however small, however fragile. She realized that respect did not always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in small acknowledgments, in the rhythm of daily toil, in the eyes of someone who simply watched and understood. And in that silent house, with its creaking floors and steady warmth, the first real seeds of confidence took root. She was learning not only to endure, but to matter, to herself, and to those who had begun to see her for more than her shape. And slowly, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. Trust begins in the smallest gestures, and hearts soften in the warmth of shared moments. Morning light spilled into the kitchen, golden and soft, catching dust motes that floated lazily through the air. Eliza moved among the tables and counters, flour dusting her hair, sleeves rolled up, hands busy shaping dough. Laughter echoed behind her light, genuine. The children of the ranch, Silas's children, were helping in their own clumsy way, giggles spilling over spills of flour and cracked eggs. Eliza paused, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead, and for the first time allowed herself a small smile. These moments, simple, imperfect, were hers. She could feel the edges of her former shame soften, replaced by something warmer. Silas entered quietly, leaning against the doorway, observing. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. His eyes softened as he watched Eliza guide the children, hands gentle yet firm, voice patient. "Careful with the eggs," he said finally, tone low, carrying a hint of humor. Eliza glanced at him, cheeks warming. I think they're learning," she said, voice small but steady. "They are," he replied, nodding slightly. "And you're learning too." The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the morning bustle, but they carried weight. Eliza felt a flutter of something unfamiliar, approval that was not tied to shame, recognition that wasn't burdened with pity. Later, in the fields, she moved among the rows of vegetables and small crops, hands deep in soil, sun on her back. Silas worked nearby, repairing a fence, his movements measured, calm. Occasionally, he would glance her way, and their eyes would meet briefly, unspoken understanding passing between them. The children followed her lead, mimicking her actions, asking questions about the soil and plants. Eliza answered patiently, showing them how to bend without breaking, how to care without force. Each explanation, each gentle correction, was a small bridge being built between herself and this quiet family that had accepted her. Evening fell, painting the ranch in soft amber hues. The smell of cooked bread and wood smoke drifted through the rooms. Eliza and Silas sat at opposite ends of the table, children laughing and eating between them. Conversation was minimal, punctuated with small shared glances and fleeting smiles, but in its subtlety, intimacy began to grow. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the table. She realized she was no longer counting her mistakes, measuring her failures against a world that had rejected her. Here, every small success mattered. Every shared laugh, every nod of approval, every tiny gesture of recognition became a thread in the fabric of trust she was weaving. Later that night, she stood by the riverbank, moonlight reflecting on the gentle ripples. The day's warmth lingered in her chest, mingling with the lingering ache of labor and effort. She breathed deeply, tasting freedom in the crisp night air, feeling the first subtle shift in her heart. And in these quiet moments, she discovered that belonging is built one gentle act at a time. Evenings at the ranch had begun to feel less like chores and more like rituals. Eliza moved through them with a newfound confidence, baking bread with the children, sharing small laughs over spilled flour, and catching glimpses of Silas's rare, quiet smiles. The house itself seemed to breathe with her. Floorboards creaked under familiar footsteps, the stove hummed softly in the corner, and the animals moved with predictable rhythm. In this predictable world, she discovered room for subtle joy. One late afternoon, she helped the children gather eggs from the coop. A particularly wily chicken darted past her feet, sending her stumbling into Silas, who had come to check the fence. "You okay?" he asked, steady, calm, his hands brushing hers to steady her. Eliza's cheeks warmed. I'm fine," she replied, a small laugh escaping despite herself. "Careful," he said softly, voice low, almost teasing. "Not all of life will steady itself for you." The words were simple, but they lingered. She felt a flicker of warmth, not only from the touch of his hands, but from the trust in his presence. He wasn't hovering, wasn't commanding. He was simply there, offering steadiness where she had once felt only instability. Days stretched into weeks. The rhythm of the ranch carried her through, teaching her resilience in small increments, feeding animals, mending fences, cooking, and caring for the children. All became measures of her own growing strength. Each success was private, but deeply felt. She began to see that competence was more than physical. It was patience, persistence, and the courage to continue even when fear whispered otherwise. Silas noticed. Small nods, brief words of approval, or simply standing quietly as she completed a task. They were his ways of acknowledging her growth without overstatement. And slowly, those silent recognitions mattered more than any applause she had ever longed for in the town she had left behind. One evening, after chores were done, Eliza and the children sat outside, the sky painted in bruised purples and soft oranges. The air smelled of earth, rain, and wood smoke. Silas joined them, sitting on a low fence post, watching as the children chattered and laughed. Eliza looked at him, curiosity and something softer tugging at her heart. "Do you ever regret coming here?" she asked cautiously. He studied the horizon, voice quiet. "No, regret doesn't usually teach you anything worth keeping. The hard parts, they remind you what matters." She nodded slowly, understanding more than the words alone conveyed. In that moment, the unspoken tension between them eased. It wasn't love yet, not in the romantic sense, but a fragile trust, a slow recognition that she could be valued for who she was, not just tolerated for what she could do. Night fell, and the stars sparkled above the quiet ranch. Fireflies blinked lazily in the garden, and the soft murmur of the river accompanied the hush of the night. Eliza stood at the edge of the porch, breath deep, feeling the first embers of belonging settle in her chest. But even the softest heart cannot avoid the coming storm. Courage is measured not in the calm, but in the storm that tests your soul. The sky darkened with a sudden intensity, clouds rolling across the horizon like a tide of ink. Wind swept across the ranch, rattling the windows, bending trees, and whipping at the loose strands of Eliza's hair. She paused at the doorway, chest tight, eyes tracing the distant horizon. Something wild was coming, and she knew it would demand more than her hands or her labor. It would demand courage. Silas moved quietly beside her, adjusting the reins of the horses, his movements deliberate, calm. "Storm's coming. We need to secure the barn and the animals," he said, voice low but steady. Eliza nodded, adrenaline pushing away the fatigue that had settled in her limbs over weeks of work. She could feel her heartbeat, fast and urgent, but she did not hesitate. The storm did not allow hesitation. Rain arrived like a torrent, slashing against her face, soaking through clothing in seconds. The wind tore across the open fields, threatening to toss buckets and tools as if they were toys. She struggled with the barn doors, their wood swollen with moisture, hinges stiff and unyielding. Her arms ached, hands raw from gripping wet handles, but she did not stop. Silas appeared at her side, bracing the door. "Lean into it. Don't fight the wood. Work with it." Together, they forced the doors closed, securing the barn against the rising wind. Eliza's muscles screamed, sweat and rain mingling on her skin, but the sight of the barn standing firm brought a spark of pride. Then came the alarm, the children screaming from the edge of the field. A runaway wagon had broken free from its tether, racing toward the creek, where water had risen dangerously from the sudden storm. Eliza's heart seized. She did not think. She ran. Her boots sank into the mud, her dress soaked, arms flailing as she reached the wagon. Silas was at her side, but she took the lead, gripping the wagon, pulling against its momentum, dragging it from the edge with every ounce of strength. The child inside clung to her arm, terror in wide eyes. "It's okay. It's okay," she whispered, voice firm despite the storm raging around them. "You're safe now." The child trembled. Mud streaked across small hands and cheeks, but slowly, trust began to form. Eliza's hands burned, muscles screaming, but she did not falter. Hours passed like this. Rain turned to wind, wind to chaos. Trees fell near fences, barn timbers groaned under the weight of water, and yet Eliza moved relentlessly, hauling supplies, securing animals, rescuing what could be saved. Every task tested her. Every decision weighed against fear. Silas watched, awestruck but silent. He did not need to speak. The storm revealed her courage, her resilience, her unwavering determination. The mud and exhaustion that once defined her seemed to vanish beneath the fire of her actions. Night fell, black and unrelenting, but the storm's fury persisted. Eliza guided Silas's children to safety, covering them with blankets, checking for scrapes and bruises. Her own body was soaked, shivering, yet her mind remained alert, focused, unwavering. In the chaos, she glimpsed the reflection of herself. No longer the girl who fell in the mud of Willow Creek, no longer trembling at mockery, no longer measured by the weight she carried. She was strength incarnate, rising with the storm, commanding her own courage. By the time the rain softened, by the time the wind relented, the ranch had survived, scarred, battered, but intact. Eliza stood beside Silas, shoulders aching, heart pounding, mud and sweat mixing into the proof of her endurance. Silas's gaze met hers, no words, only a nod, respect, unspoken, unwavering, earned. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, and she had faced both with unshakable courage. The storm's rage finally began to wane, leaving the ranch drenched, battered, and trembling in the aftermath. Mud clung to Eliza's boots, her dress plastered to her skin, hair dripping with water and wind. Yet her chest heaved with exhilaration, not exhaustion. She had faced the chaos, faced fear, and emerged unbroken. Silas moved beside her, silent but present. The children, safe now, clung to one another. Why? Dyed and muddy. Eliza bent down, brushing rain, soaked hair from their faces, murmuring gentle reassurances. "You're safe," she said softly, voice low but unwavering. "Nothing's going to hurt you now." The words, though meant for them, resonated deeper within herself. Safety had been earned, not given. Courage had been claimed, not borrowed. They assessed the damage. Fences splintered, the barn roof partially collapsed, tools scattered across the muddy fields. Most people would have despaired. Most people would have retreated. But Eliza, soaked and trembling from adrenaline, only saw challenges waiting to be met. Silas handed her a hammer and nails. "We fix it," he said simply, "together. Together." The word felt foreign at first, then grounding. She joined him in repairing the fences, shoring up the barn, moving supplies with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Each swing of the hammer, each tug against soaked wood, each haul of heavy feed bags was a declaration. She would not be invisible. She would not be defined by shame. Later, the children played quietly near the house, their small laughter fragile against the remnants of wind and rain. Silas and Eliza worked side by side, a rhythm forming without conversation, movements measured, trust implicit, endurance shared. When a beam threatened to collapse, Eliza didn't hesitate. She lifted, braced, guided it into place with raw strength and precision. Silas's eyes widened slightly, brief acknowledgement of what he already knew. "You've changed," he said quietly, almost to himself. Eliza's lips curved in a tired, mud-streaked smile. "I had to," she admitted, voice hoarse. "I had to be more than what they made me." And in that moment, standing amid the storm's ruin, she realized that she had done it. She had confronted fear, chaos, and her own self, doubt, and survived. Not as the girl who fell in the mud, but as someone stronger, braver, undeniable. Night fell with heavy clouds clearing to reveal a sky studded with stars. The ranch lay quiet, battered but alive, and Eliza stood at the edge of the field, breathing deeply, mud and sweat still clinging to her skin. Silas approached, silent, and extended a hand, not for guidance, not for rescue, but as a gesture of unspoken respect. She took it, and for the first time felt herself truly seen. The storm had tested her body, her heart, her courage, and in its wake, her worth was undeniable. True courage is not just surviving storms. It is standing tall when the world expects you to bow. Eliza rode back into Willow Creek, the town that had once ridiculed her, that had thrown mud and mockery in her path. The streets were narrow, familiar, yet now charged with tension. Whispers rippled through the crowd, eyes following her with a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and unease. She dismounted carefully, mud streaking her boots, hair damp but spirit unbroken. Silas stood beside her, stoic and steady, his presence a shield and a promise. The children clung to the edges of the wagon. Why? Died but trusting her. A hush fell over the town square. Faces she remembered, neighbors, merchants, even distant relatives, stared. Judgment and memory tangled with a grudging curiosity. She could feel their skepticism pressing in, but she straightened her shoulders, drawing herself taller than she had ever dared. The town meeting began in the creaking hall of the old courthouse. Voices rose, sharp and accusing. "What right have you to return?" one woman demanded, eyes narrow. "After the shame you brought." Eliza's breath caught for a moment, a whisper of the old fear brushing at her chest. But she steadied herself, letting the storm of her own courage settle. She looked around the room, gaze steady, and spoke, not in anger, not in pleading, but with the quiet strength that had carried her through every trial. "I've done nothing to hide," she said, voice clear and unwavering. "I've faced storms you could never imagine. I've carried weight, fear, ridicule, responsibility, and I stand here not for pity, but for truth." The murmurs rose again, some scoffing, some uncertain. But she held their gaze, unflinching. Silas stepped forward, quiet but commanding. "She saved my family. She saved this ranch. She didn't ask for thanks. She didn't seek glory. She acted because it was right. And that is more than any of you can claim." The room shifted, the weight of silence pressing against those who had mocked her. Eliza felt a spark, fragile yet undeniable. Courage was not just her armor. It was the voice that could no longer be ignored. She continued, each word measured, resonating with honesty. "The world measures worth in inches and pounds, in appearances. But true worth is measured in action, in heart, in courage. And I have lived that courage, not to prove myself to you, but to prove to myself that I matter." Faces softened. Some averted their eyes, ashamed. Others studied her with a new lens, curiosity, respect, hesitation. The children in the room whispered among themselves, eyes wide, sensing the power of truth laid bare. The townsfolk who had laughed at her fall in the mud could not deny it. Eliza had become something undeniable, not a victim, not a joke, but a force of strength, integrity, and unyielding courage. Silas watched quietly, his presence grounding her, giving weight to her words without a single touch. And in that quiet support, Eliza realized that this trial was not for them. It was for her, for the girl who had once bowed under ridicule, for the woman who now stood tall. Evening settled over the courthouse, light fading through dusty windows. The whispers softened into murmurs of reluctant admiration. Eyes that had once sneered now lingered with acknowledgement. And somewhere deep within, Eliza felt a shift, not in the town, not yet fully, but in herself. The trial had begun, and courage had spoken louder than shame. The murmurs in the courthouse grew, hesitant now, as Eliza held her head high. Every whisper, every sidelong glance, reminded her of the girl who had fled Willow Creek in shame. But that girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had endured storms, saved lives, and faced fear without flinching. Silas's steady gaze never wavered. He stood silently beside her, a pillar of calm in the tense room. His presence was a reminder. Courage was not only about action. It was about holding ground when the world expects you to fall. One by one, townsfolk stepped forward, some apologetic, some hesitant, but all compelled by what they had witnessed, by what could not be denied. We underestimated you," an older man admitted, voice rough, eyes lowered. "Never again will we question your worth." Eliza's lips curved into a small, steady smile. She didn't need their approval. It had never been the point. But acknowledgement, spoken aloud, carried weight. It confirmed what she had always known. Bravery, heart, and integrity mattered far more than ridicule or appearance. The children, once wide-eyed observers, now looked to her with admiration, their tiny hands brushing against hers. "You're really brave," one whispered. Eliza knelt slightly, hands resting on her knees, voice gentle. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," she said softly, "but the choice to act anyway, and you, every one of you, can find that strength inside yourselves." Even the harshest critics could not ignore the truth in her words. Silence fell again, but this time it was not tension. It was respect, recognition of courage that had transcended mockery, ridicule, and past shame. The town slowly began to shift. Faces that had once sneered now softened. nods and murmurs of approval spreading. She had not merely returned, she had transformed. The moral arc had shifted, the scales of judgment tipping in favor of truth and resilience. Silas placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, light and steady. No words were needed. The touch was affirmation, respect, and quiet pride. Eliza felt it, not as a gift, but as the acknowledgment she had earned, through sweat, determination, and unwavering courage. By nightfall, Willow Creek was no longer the same town she had left. Not everyone had forgiven, not everyone had forgotten, but respect had begun to bloom where ridicule once thrived. She had claimed her place, not as a spectacle, not as someone to pity, but as a woman whose actions spoke louder than words or appearance. Eliza stepped outside the courthouse, the cool evening wind on her face, stars shimmering above. She inhaled deeply, heart steady, mind clear. The storm within her had passed, the storm without had revealed her strength, and with the town finally seeing her, she could embrace the life she had built. Every dawn is a promise, and every heart brave enough to rise earns its light. The first light of morning stretched across the ranch, spilling golden over dew, soaked fields and timbered buildings. Birds stirred, their songs tentative but persistent, carrying the soft rhythm of a new day. Eliza stepped onto the porch, arms stretching toward the warmth, heart steady with quiet anticipation. Silas was already there, leaning against the railing, eyes on the horizon. The wind teased at his hair, brushing lightly against her face. For a moment, silence held them, a shared breath, the calm before a life fully embraced. The children ran across the yard, laughter bubbling over the frost, kissed grass. Eliza watched, chest swelling with pride and tenderness. She had once been invisible, mocked and shamed. Now she was woven into the fabric of this place, a presence of strength and warmth, seen and cherished. She turned toward Silas, finding in his steady gaze the reflection of all she had become. No words were spoken, none were needed. Recognition passed between them, quiet, weighty, profound. He approached slowly, boots crunching on frost-bitten earth. Eliza's heart fluttered, not in fear, but in a fragile hope. He stopped before her, eyes calm, unwavering. "Eliza," he said softly, voice carrying the gravity of everything unsaid, "I never needed to save you, you saved yourself, but if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of our mornings and nights by your side." Her breath caught. She had dreamed of respect, of belonging, of courage seen, but this was beyond any expectation. She nodded, voice barely above a whisper, yet clear. "Yes, yes, Silas." He smiled, a rare warm curve of lips, and extended his hand. She took it, fingers curling around his, and in that simple gesture, a lifetime of trials, of storms survived, of courage endured, seemed to find its reward. The children cheered, running between them, laughter rising like music through the crisp morning air. Even the animals seemed to sense it. The horses nickered softly, the chickens clucked their morning greeting, and the wind carried with it the promise of a new life, untethered from shame. Eliza felt the weight of the past lift slightly from her shoulders, replaced by warmth, belonging, and the gentle certainty of love earned through persistence and heart. As the sun rose higher, spilling gold across the land, she glanced over the fields, the house, the river glinting in the morning light. Each moment of humiliation, each step through mud, each act of courage flashed through her memory, and she realized every trial had led her here. Every fall, every struggle, every storm had been a path to this dawn. Courage is the measure of a soul, not the shape of its shell. The morning deepened, sunlight spilling across the ranch in waves of warmth. Eliza walked slowly among the fields, Silas at her side, children skipping ahead with laughter that sparkled like bells in the crisp air. The house, once a place of labor and quiet endurance, now hummed with life and belonging. Every corner, every beam, every weathered board bore witness to her journey. Trials endured, storms faced, and courage earned. She inhaled the scent of fresh earth, of wood smoke, of morning, and felt it settle into her chest. This was home, and she had claimed it. Silas stopped near the riverbank, turning to her with quiet intensity. "Eliza," he said, voice low but steady, "I've watched you grow through fire, through rain, through storms I couldn't imagine. You've earned more than respect. You've earned my heart." Her gaze met his, and in that instant, all the shame and ridicule of her past fell away, leaving only clarity and truth. She reached for his hand, fingers curling around his, strong and certain. "Yes," she breathed, voice trembling but certain. "I will, with you." The children cheered, running in wide circles, their small feet kicking up frost and dew. Even the animals seemed to join the celebration. The horses nickered, the dogs barked happily, the birds flitted from tree to tree. Laughter and light filled the space that had once been shadowed by mockery and fear. Eliza felt the weight of every humiliation she had endured dissolve in the brilliance of this new dawn. She was no longer the girl who fell in the mud, the object of scorn and gossip. She was herself, resilient, brave, worthy, loved. Silas drew her close, their hands intertwined, and together they watched the sun rise higher over the sprawling land. The river glinted like molten gold. The wind whispered through the trees, and the world seemed to pause in quiet reverence for the life she had fought to claim. Eliza's eyes swept over the fields, the house, the animals, and the children, the family she had earned through courage, heart, and determination. She realized the truth that had carried her through every trial. Worth was not in the shape of a body, nor the judgment of others, but in the strength of spirit and the courage to rise again. And so, in the quiet glow of dawn, she understood at last. Life rewards the brave, the steadfast, and the compassionate, and she would never again doubt her own worth. The morning stretched on, golden and unbroken, a new chapter of life awaiting with laughter, love, and peace. The ranch, the family, the river, the wind, they all embraced her triumph, just as she embraced the life she had built, hand in hand with Silas, heart steady, spirit free. Courage is the measure of a soul, not the shape of its shell.